The identity of Jack the Ripper, who terrified the streets of London in 1888, has been debated since the murders took place. It is the most well-known unsolved murders in history. There have been many suspects over the years, and most seem very promising. The police went house to house searching for evidence. They interviewed butchers, doctors, and surgeons, all without success. Police inspectors Frederick Aberline, Henry Moore, and Walter Andrews were sent by Scotland Yard to help with the investigation after the first of the canonical five, Polly Nichols. Sir Charles Warren was Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Edmund Reed, Inspector at H Division, worked on the early investigation. Countless other police officers and inspectors helped on the case. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly were all believed to have been murdered by the same person. There were other murders at the time. Some even involved similar mutilations, but these women are all known as the Canonical Five. Montague John Druitt is a popular Ripper suspect, although he is not believed to be a suspect at the time of the murders. He was born upper middle class in 1857. He went to school at Winchester College and the University of Oxford. After graduating, he became a school teacher at George Valentine's boarding school, and he started his journey to become a lawyer. Also, he was accepted to the Honorable Society of the Inner Temple. His father gave him a legacy of $500 and gave him a loan for his membership. In 1885, he became a barrister. That same year, his father died, and most of the money in his will that he left for his son was to pay back the loan that his father had given him. He ended up with very little money in the end. As a hobby, Montague Druitt played cricket for many different clubs. He was the Blackheath Cricket Club secretary and treasurer in 1888. On the 30th of November, 1888, Montague John Druitt was fired from the boarding school he worked at. The reason was not fully clear. His brother had said that he had gotten into serious trouble. It was described that he was sexually insane. He disappeared shortly after he was fired from the boys' school. His cricket club replaced him as secretary and treasurer. His brother heard from a friend on December 11th that no one had seen Montague for weeks, so he went to the boys' school where his brother worked. That is where he found out that Montague had been fired and he had gotten into serious trouble. It was about a month after his disappearance until his body was found. On December 31st, 1888, Montague John Druitt's body was found floating in the River Thames by Henry Winsdale. On his body, the police found rocks in his pockets to hold down his body, a train ticket from Hammersmith to London, dated December 1st, 1888, a precious metal watch, a $50 check, and gold, and personal papers. This led investigators to believe that he was not robbed, and that he ended his own life by drowning while in an unsound state of mind. It's possible that Montague was fired because he was taking advantage of one of his students at the school, or because he was a homosexual, but there is not much evidence for this. His mother was sent to an asylum in 1888, and she died there in 1890. A few members of the family had psychiatric problems, and a few ended their own life, just like Montague. It's believed that he may have been just suffering from depression or psychosis, and ended his life after he was fired from the school. A letter that was written for his brother by Montague was found in his room. Since Friday, I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die. He was buried in Wimborne Cemetery after the inquest into his death. On November 9th, the body of Mary Jane Kelly was found, the last of the canonical five Ripper victims. And November 30th, Montague Druitt was fired, and then he disappeared. Some speculate that Druitt was the murderer. The killings ended shortly after his death. He lived and worked in London, so he knew the area, but no evidence shows that he was in the area of the scene during the time of the murders. It was reported that Druitt's family believed that he was the murderer, but this information did not come directly from the family. Aaron Kosminski is another popular Ripper suspect. He worked as a barber and hairdresser in Whitechapel. He lived close to some of the murder scenes. He had mental problems, possible paranoid schizophrenia. He stopped working and relied on his family for money. He was sent to a workhouse in 1890, and then he was released shortly after. But he was put back into a workhouse by police, and then sent to an insane asylum in 1891. He stayed at the asylum until 1919, when he died at age 53. He weighed just 93 pounds. Melville McNaughton, the Assistant Chief Constable of the London Metropolitan Police, wrote a memorandum in 1894, writing about some of the Ripper suspects. He wrote this about Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane, owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum. It's believed Israel Schwartz, who witnessed a man dragging Elizabeth Stride to the ground shortly before her body was discovered in Deptfield's yard, got a good look at the suspect and identified him, but refused to testify against him. In Sir Robert Anderson's memoirs, he wrote, "I will merely add that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him." The man Israel Schwartz supposedly identified was indeed Aaron Kosminski. He lived and worked in Whitechapel, close to the scenes of the murders. He was familiar with the area and suffered mental problems. He supposedly had a hatred of women. He was homicidal. Many believed he was the Ripper, including the police at the time. John Pizer was a shoemaker with the nickname Leather Apron. He was known to intimidate local sex workers with a knife. He was arrested September 10, 1888, but he was released after his alibi was verified for both of the murders. George Chapman is another popular Ripper suspect. His real name was Severn Klosowski. He was in London during the time of the murders. He was living and working close to the crime scenes. After the Jack the Ripper murders, he was involved in a series of murders himself. He would poison his victims. He worked as a barber and was trained as a surgeon in Poland before moving to England. He lived and worked in Whitechapel until he moved to America in 1891 with Lucy Bandersky. She became pregnant. Charles became violent and assaulted Lucy. She moved back to England and had the baby. Charles eventually followed, but the pair separated after Charles found another woman who eventually left Charles. He began a relationship with Mary Spink. They ran a barbershop together. Mary played the piano and George was the barber. Their business was doing well, but George was known to beat Mary. Neighbors would hear Mary crying and screaming at night during the assaults. She was even seen with bruises on her face and her neck. The barbershop eventually went out of business, so he began working as a manager of a pub. On April 3, 1897, George went to a chemist and bought 1 ounce of tartar emetic. He killed Mary with poisoning on December 25, 1897. Another woman, Bessie Taylor, was hired at the pub by George. They began to date, and then George began beating Bessie as well. George would become very violent and take it out on the women in his life. She became very ill, and the doctors could not save her. She died February 13, 1901. In 1901, he hired Maud Marsh at his new bar, the Monument Tavern, which he would later try to burn down. He soon started a relationship with her and again became brutally violent with Maud. He would beat her repeatedly. She was too poisoned and died on the 22nd of October, 1902. But by this point, the police had become very suspicious. Women who were involved with George Chapman kept dying under suspicious circumstances. The police found that Maud Marsh had been poisoned, and Mary and Bessie's bodies were both exhumed. They learned that the two women were also poisoned. George was arrested and put on trial for murder. He was convicted on March 19, 1903, and sentenced to death by hanging. On April 7, 1903, he was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. Some believed that he was responsible for the Whitechapel murders at the time, including some of the police officers, due to the fact that the murder stopped after George left for America. But many people aren't so sure. How could a man go from brutally murdering and mutilating prostitutes in the streets of Whitechapel, then move to starting relationships with his victims and then poisoning them? Police Inspector Frederick Aberline thought George could have been Jack the Ripper. He said, "A man who could watch his wives being slowly tortured to death by poison as he did was capable of anything." Charles Cross, or Charles Allen Lechmere, is another possible Ripper suspect, and for good reason. We spoke shortly about him in our last episode, but only about his discovery of the body of Polly Nichols. The opinion that Charles Cross could be Jack the Ripper was first put forth by Derek Osborne in 2000. He was not believed to be a suspect at the time. There is no direct evidence to prove Charles Cross is the murderer, but there is circumstantial evidence like the other suspects. Charles Cross's real name was Charles Allen Lechmere. He gave a fake name, the last name Cross, at the inquest, which was his stepfather's last name. During the inquest for the murder of Polly Nichols, Charles claimed he left for work at around 3:30 a.m. while walking on Bucks Row. He discovered the body of Polly Nichols laying next to a gateway. He found Nichols at about 3:40 a.m. Robert Paul reported that he saw Charles in the road and tried to avoid him at first until Charles showed him the woman in the street. Cross touched her face. It was warm, but her hands were cold. The two men discussed whether she was dead or alive, and they both went to find a policeman, leaving the woman after pulling her skirt down. They saw no blood at the scene. Police Constable John Neal found the woman shortly after the two men left. Her throat had been cut deeply twice, nearly decapitating her. She was still warm, indicating that she had been killed only minutes before she was discovered. Cross and Paul found Police Constable Jonas Mizzen, and he told the officer about the body in Bucks Row. Cross explained that he believed the woman was dead. It was reported that Cross said, "You are wanted in Bucks Row by a policeman. A woman is lying there," even though he could not possibly have known that a policeman had already found the body. Another report claimed that he said, "You're wanted down there," and just pointed towards Bucks Row. When the two men were back at the scene investigating whether or not the woman was alive, before leaving the scene, neither one reported seeing any blood. But when Police Constable Neal arrived, blood was visible. The two men also did not see any other person on Bucks Row besides each other and the deceased woman. Some believe that Charles was the killer. He slashed Polly's throat and began mutilating her body when he heard Paul walking up in the distance. He quickly stood up to be standing over the body when Paul arrived. But neither Paul or Police Constable Mizzen reported seeing any blood on Charles Cross's body. All we really have to go on is the fact that Charles was at the scene when Paul arrived. No blood was around the body until shortly later, meaning the murder had happened very recently. Charles possibly told Police Constable Mizzen that another police constable was at the scene to avoid suspicion. Charles gave the false last name of Cross at the inquest, and he lived and worked in the area as a cartman, so he could move around at night without suspicion. Charles did not have psychiatric problems, and he lived in the area until the ripe old age of 71, where he died in 1920. It is very unlikely that a serial killer stops killing unless they are arrested or they die. Francis Tumblety was an American quack doctor. He was a patent medicine doctor. He was known to sell Tumblety's Pimple Destroyer and Dr. Moses' Indian root pills. He went across America and Canada selling patent medicines. He had numerous arrests throughout his life. He was even arrested and brought to Washington, D.C. after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. The police thought that he was tied to David Harold, but he was released shortly after his arrest. Tumblety also had a collection of uteruses, preserved in jars, which he would show off to his dinner guests. He fled to London after a man died the same day that he took some of Tumblety's medicine, and after he was sued by William Carroll for false testimony. After reaching London, he stayed at a boarding house in Whitechapel. Not much is known about Tumblety's stay in London, but Tumblety was caught after being involved sexually with another man. Homosexuality was illegal in London during Victorian times. He was arrested for gross indecency in November 1888. He was known to have a strong hatred of women and prostitutes. Police were also looking at him for the Whitechapel murders, and he knew it. He fled England after making bail, going to France and then back to America. A news article talks about Tumblety's possible involvement in the murders. Something about Dr. Tumblety, San Francisco, November 22nd. Chief of Police Crowley has lately been in correspondence with officials of Scotland Yard, London, regarding Dr. Tumblety, who is at present under arrest on suspicion of being implicated in the Whitechapel murders. Police inspectors from London traveled to America to keep an eye on him, but he was never extradited for the murders. Tumblety was very eccentric. He had a large mustache and he often wore a uniform. Many believed he would have stuck out in the streets of Whitechapel if he had been the murderer. Also, it's very rare that a male homosexual serial killer kills women. They usually kill their own sexual preference. Prince Albert Victor had also been a popular Ripper suspect, especially after the movie From Hell, starring Johnny Depp. It's proposed that Prince Albert committed or had someone commit the murders after he was driven mad by syphilis. The murders were covered up to protect the royal family, although this is mostly thought of as a conspiracy theory with little evidence. Some believe that Prince Albert could possibly have been the killer. James Maybrick, who was a Liverpool cotton merchant, became a very popular and very controversial Ripper suspect after a diary was made public in the early 1990s. James Maybrick was a wealthy man. He traveled back and forth from America to London for business. He got malaria in Norfolk, Virginia, and he was treated with malaria medicine which contained arsenic. He took this medicine every day until his death. In England, when James was 42, he met the 18-year-old Florence Chandler from Mobile, Alabama. The two were married shortly after. They had 2 children together, and while away on business trips, James and Florence both cheated on one another. On April 27, 1889, James became very ill, which continued to get worse until he died on May 11th. Authorities were suspicious of his death, and it was believed his death was from arsenic poisoning. Florence was arrested, and she was convicted of the murder of James Maybrick and sentenced to death. She was eventually released in 1904. Now we travel back to the 1990s, when Michael Barrett made a diary public. He claimed he received the diary from a friend in a pub named Tony DeVerix. He claimed that Tony gave him the diary and asked him to do something with it. In the diary, the author's real name was not given. The diary was about a man's revenge on his wife, which he referred to as the whore. The diary goes through the mind of a crazed man. That man was James Maybrick. Details of the murders are given, and the diary claimed that he wrote the Dear Boss letter. There are many historical details that are correct in the diary, and a forensic examination of the diary was completed. Many tests done to the ink proved it to be Victorian ink, consistent with ink that was available in the 1880s. The author correctly describes the effects on the body of arsenic poisoning. The letters FM for Florence Maybrick are seen at the crime scene photo of Mary Jane Kelly, written in blood on the wall. There is also a F carved into her arm next to a heart tattoo. Whether or not someone just looked at the photos until they found a blood stain that looked like the initials they needed for a hoax, or the diary is genuine and James Maybrick really is Jack the Ripper and wrote the diary, there are arguments on both sides, real or a hoax. The man that came forward with the diary, Michael Barrett, eventually came forward stating that he wrote the diary with help from his wife, but he would later go back on this statement. A Victorian pocket watch, which was bought before the diary became public, also added credibility to the diary. The watch's owner found scratch marks on the back of the watch by chance one day and looked at it under a microscope. The initials of the canonical 5 victims, the words "I am Jack" and the signature of J. Maybrick were all found carved into the back of the 18-karat gold case pocket watch. The pocket watch was made in Leeds around 1846. It was examined by Dr. Stephen Turgoose from the Corrosion and Protection Center at the University of Manchester Institute of Science and Technology. He used an electron microscope. He said that it is clear that the engravings predate the vast majority of superficial surface scratch marks, evidenced by the rounded edges of the markings and polishing out in places would indicate a substantial age. That there are no features observed which conclusively prove the age of the engravings. They could have been produced recently and deliberately artificially aged by polishing. This would have been a complex, multi-stage process. Many of the features are only resolved by the scanning of electron microscope. The watch was viewed by other scientists who agreed that the carvings were most likely very old. Most scholars believe the diary to be a hoax, but James Maybrick still makes the list of a Ripper suspect. Michael Ostrog is another Ripper suspect. He was a scammer, a con man, and a small-time thief. He spent significant times in and out of prison and asylums. Sir Melville Macnaghten's memoranda in 1894 described that he was a Russian doctor and a convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. This man's antecedents were of the worst possible type, and his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. It's possible he may have been incarcerated during some of the murders. Most do not believe that he was Jack the Ripper. James Thomas Sadler was friends of Frances Coles, a victim of the Whitechapel murders, but she is not one of the canonical 5 Jack the Ripper victims. Sir Melville Macnaghten wrote that James Sadler was a man of ungovernable temper and entirely addicted to drink and the company of the lowest prostitutes. Sadler was arrested for Frances Coles' murder, but there was little evidence against him. She had 2 deep slash wounds to her neck, just like the other Ripper victims. He was believed to be a suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders at the time, but police found out that he was at sea working from July 16th to July 20th on the SS Fez at the time when another Whitechapel murder took place. In total, there were 11 women brutally murdered in Whitechapel between April 3rd, 1888 and February 13th, 1891. Their names are Emma Elizabeth Smith, Martha Tabram, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly, Rose Milett, Alice McKenzie, Frances Coles, and an unidentified woman. Whether or not they were all killed by the same man, or as some believe, the same woman, for a few years, Whitechapel was a killing field. Almost all the women were known prostitutes, and they were all down on hard times. The killer murdered them for his own sick pleasure. Maybe one day Jack the Ripper's name will make it into the history books if it's not already there. And the list continues to grow. Who do you think Jack the Ripper is? Leave it in the comments section. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I really hope you enjoyed this one. And this is the conclusion on Jack the Ripper. We'll see you on the next one. Peace.